Welcome to the COMMSversations podcast, where we break down communications strategy, storytelling, and the future of comms. And now, here is your host, Enrico Dinges.
Welcome to the COMMSversations podcast, where we explore the power of strategic communication to shape culture, policy, and purpose. I'm your host, Enrico Dinges. And today I'm excited to have our special guest, John Friedman, who's a business consultant, a fractional sustainability strategist, and author of Managing Sustainability, First Steps to First Class. Today, we're going to dive into the intersection of sustainability and communications, explore how companies can authentically lead with purpose, and ask the tough question, will corporate sustainability survive political headwinds in the Trump era? John, I want to thank you for joining the COMMSversations podcast. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Enrico. First of all, I believe that this is a very important conversation to be having right now. And second of all, I'm just so thrilled to connect with you again, former colleague and longtime friend.
Absolutely, John. I remember October of 2011, settling into my cube at Sodexo, and you were my neighbor. And so it's been a good while, and it's been great to see just your career, your journey, and where you are today. I mean, I knew you first of all as an expert in communications, and certainly that's grown. And so I just do kind of want to start off with talking about, where did you grow up? Where did you go to school?
Well, the journey's been an interesting one, and it has not always been obvious what the next step was going to be. But where I grew up was in upstate New York and in Germany. And then I went to school, let's just limit it to college, to Albany State University in New York for communications, and the Duke Fuqua School of Business in North Carolina for a business certificate. So I've got a degree from Albany and a business certificate from Duke. So that's really the intersection that I've always worked on and worked from. And that's how that's kind of been the through line or the foundation for my career.
Got it. And so again, I knew you in similar to me in a communications role, but then you started to get into sustainability in a more formal way. And can you talk about what kind of led in that direction?
Yeah, absolutely. It actually started before I went to Sodexo. I'd been working with a previous company in a communications role. And there it was really started out as an internal communications role for part of a redeployment, they called it, which was a restructuring of the business. And then that gradually picked up some elements of external communications, public affairs, and so forth. And then they handed me this next project coming from our parent company in France, which wasn't called sustainability. It was called the Lafarge Way. And it was based on our principles of action that the company had, which were the topics that they felt were the most important for them to address to meet their business growth and profitability ambitions. And so that became kind of a passion for me. I didn't realize it, so I went back into a more traditional communications role. And when I ended up at Sodexo, one of the things that attracted me was that they were just starting their sustainability journey. And I wanted to kind of recreate what I'd done before, that transition from communications to sustainability. But the funny thing is, the communications and strategy never were far behind.
And so you kind of get into that, and then I guess through your next steps in your career also had both communications and sustainability touch points. But then you end up writing a book on a lot of your experiences, a lot of your expertise. Can you tell me a little bit about what inspired you to jot everything down and make it available in the book form?
Well, first of all, the number one reason why I did the book was because a publisher, Business Expert Press, reached out to me. And while I was making the transition back to sustainability when I was in a more traditional communications role, I started with some friends of mine, a sustainable business network in Washington, became the largest SBN in the country. And I started writing articles and blog posts for them, gradually was asked to write for Huffington Post. And it was some of the writings in Huffington Post, in the Huffington Post business section, that came to the attention of this publisher. And they said, there's a best of in here. And my thinking at the time was, let me update these articles and let's put this structure to it. And they really came up with the idea of the concept of going from the beginning, early stages, right through to how do you build a program that becomes an exemplar and is considered first class.
Got it. That's amazing. So through your experiences, I did kind of want to touch on this intersection, again, of communications and sustainability, and kind of think through, from your perspective, what does communication, the role does it have in embedding sustainability into a company's DNA, into its strategy?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is, if a company says sustainability or anything is in their DNA, my first question is, why do you feel the need to tell me that? Why is it not so visually expressed in your day-to-day existence in the world that people can't see it? And you're referring to it as in your DNA because it's obviously a recessive trait. I don't have to tell people that I've got the DNA for male pattern baldness. Just look at me. The same way with communications, you have to build it into the company and build it into the strategy. And if it's in there, like the old TV commercial used to say, it's in there and it's obvious to those hearing or interacting with you or hearing your stories.
Got it. So, I mean, along those lines, so what's the biggest mistakes you see companies making when they're communicating sustainability?
I have to say that the biggest mistake is even not intentionally, but making it a nice to have or separate from the actual business. Have a separate name for their program that's not related to the business, a separate tagline, sometimes a separate logo, and I'll even go as far as to say a separate report sends a message of separation. I mentioned earlier, the Lafarge didn't call it sustainability. We called it the Lafarge way. It was integral to the way the company did its business and how it appeared in the world. And for our experience at Sodexo, the tagline at the time for the company was making every day a better day. And I wrote in a presentation, if we're making every day a better day, then we are making every tomorrow a better tomorrow. And the name of the sustainability program became the Better Tomorrow Plan, which, as you can see, is an expression of how do we realize the company's tagline and mission. It isn't separate at all. It reinforces it.
Why do you think companies go down that road of separating? Do they feel it's more authentic if it's not tied to their corporate brand? And so, it's sort of that reverse logic in a way. But what are you seeing as the idea behind why companies would separate it versus, as you're saying, it's better to integrate it within the company brand?
Well, and again, this comes from my background in communication and business strategy, which is that those are really the be all and end all. And a lot of times with sustainability, it's based on the more emotional issues or topics of the day, and companies feel like they have to say something in relationship to what's going on in the world around them, and not necessarily understand that this is just a fundamentally different way of looking at your business strategy, your cultural, your strategic, your operational, your financial, and your sales objectives can all be effectively aided by an effective sustainability program, and it's not separate. And separating it out, I understand the temptation of it, and some of it becomes historical. You have a separate report, and then the report itself becomes the objective, rather than the report being a moment in time and providing business intelligence that enables the C-suite to really look at the business and say, oh, these are the areas we can work on. These are the opportunities, weaknesses, strengths, and so forth. And at the same time, using that as a framework to share it with your external publics and helping them to understand not only what you're doing, but what reasonable expectations are of the business. It comes back, and this is not a new concept. I don't often go back and quote the great philosophers, but Socrates said, the way to gain a good reputation is to endeavor to be what you desire to appear. And I think that's the fundamental.
Around sustainability, there's just sort of your targets, what you hope to achieve, and sometimes companies are on the path, but they're falling short. How do you advise clients when it comes to that balance between transparency, but that optimism within a program?
Well, the first thing I remind clients and companies when I work for them is that transparency is only scary until you realize just how many people actually already know. Not only do all your employees know, but potentially their significant others, anyone they've talked to. So I would also, again, going back to what businesses are comfortable with and not having a separate language and a separate everything, is that businesses do projections for financials all the time. They talk about their business goals and aspirations. We've heard companies say things like, we're going to double our size and increase profitability by this year, or we're going to increase production efficiency, such a percent through the standardization of best practices, modernizing our equipment, and yet not compromising quality or safety or value. We're going to reduce our energy costs and therefore, improve our profitability. Companies talk aspirationally all the time. They're just not used to talking about it with this new way of looking at it. But my argument is, don't look at a new way of looking at it. The things I just said are all sustainability related in business language. The energy efficiency, reducing raw materials, reducing waste, not compromising safety, increasing production, growing the company. If sustainability isn't supporting those objectives, you have to really question what you're doing. And it's a reasonable question to question what you're doing, right?
Yeah, it makes sense. So do you have an example of a brand that you looked at and said they got it right, or maybe to go negative, but maybe one that missed the mark and maybe could have done something a little different?
Well, I try not to name and shame. I'm really much more about trying to, show and lead by example and point out that it can be done well. And I also try to avoid using the typical names in the space. We've all heard about Patagonia and we've all heard about Unilever, but the bottom line is not every company can be that. So I'm going to share with you 2 or 3 that I think are really good. The first one is from one of the largest producers of frozen seafood in the world. And here's something that they wrote. And I want to see if you can tell how this relates sustainability to their mission and as a through line for the history of their company. Ready? For 125 years, Highliner Foods has thrived on nature's abundance. We are committed to nurturing this bond and preserving ecosystems to support future generations to come. It's what sustains our business, our communities, and life on Earth. That ties the business and running the business sustainably right back to the business's success. Another one, a company called InstallNet that does decommissions of furniture and helping companies reconfigure their offices, something that's really, really important and happening a lot now with the whole hybrid and return to work and companies configuring their spaces. We protect the environment by diverting commercial furniture, fixtures, and equipment from landfills. We help keep these assets in use, reducing waste, creating value, and reducing carbon emissions. And the last one is an energy company. We aim to sustainably develop, construct, and operate clean, renewable energy projects in a safe and responsible manner and with respect for communities and cultures where we have a presence. Notice how all 3 of those are making a business case. They're not talking about these issues theoretically. They're not talking about them conceptually. They're not moralizing. They're simply explaining this is our ability to impact these topics in a manner that drives our business forward.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's interesting listening to that. One sort of depends on repopulating fishing responsibly to ensure that they have that resource. The other one is sustainable in its nature and repurposing something that would be going to landfill and using it to build new furniture. So that, again, in its inherent business model, it's sustainable. And then the energy is making sure that how they approach their business is keep being mindful of the impacts on the environment. So yeah, I get it. Makes sense.
And some of the words are really important, like talking about furniture and from landfill. And then in the next sentence saying we keep these assets in use. They're pointing out the value that these things already have right from the get-go. They don't use the word waste. They're assets to someone else. Exactly. So it's what is the value that is intrinsic within this that help people see the value of what they're doing. And when Highliner Foods talks about to support future generations to come, that's literally from the Brunfeld definition of sustainability. They're using the words, but they're using them in a way that is completely and linked to and not in any way separate from their business. So that's what I think is really the goal. Not we do this stuff because it's the right thing to do, because then it begs the question, the right thing for whom and who is deciding what is right? And the answer to that needs to be your customers, your investors, your employees, and the communities around you.
And I think what we're talking about here in those examples is just the importance of messaging. And so to that, and then you just mentioned different stakeholders, John. So how do you tailor sustainability messaging for those different stakeholders, right? Investors, employees, consumers?
Well, you have to find, first of all, there has to be a through line through it all. You can't say you're one thing to one group and one thing to another group. You can't sit there and say, we're the highest quality to your customers, and then tell your investors that you're seeking to do it at the lowest cost. You have to be consistent. You have to be, because a lot of those separate publics are not that separate if you think about it. Your customers also live in the community. And if you go to a community meeting and say something that contradicts what you've told them in a sales meeting, it's not going to go well. And I'm not saying the companies do this deliberately, but the idea that the message, it needs to be the same message, but tailored. Let's look at what consumers want. They want safe, quality products or services at a reasonable price. Employees want the job security, growth opportunities, and increasingly have their values reflected in their work. So where do those align? Your employees are also sometimes your customers. And if they have the opportunity to help make those products safe, high quality, and reduce costs, then the employees and the consumers are in the same mindset of whatever it is that you're doing that's supposed to achieve and can achieve both of those things at the same time. Then you add in the investors who want to maximize the return at reduced risk. Well, if you're producing safe, quality products and services at a reasonable price, you're safeguarding your profitability. That's what investors want. If you're managing the risks, that's what investors want. So it all does overlap. It's sort of a Venn diagram and finding that sweet spot in the middle.
Yeah, because messages resonate differently and are powerful depending on how they're presented and understood by the audience and the receiver of that message. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
It's interesting because it becomes a dialogue rather than just message dissemination. The storytelling becomes an invitation to a conversation. In one of the first sustainability reports that the CEO did for Lafarge, we literally wrote, or he said, I should say, the public would enjoy a start as fast as possible on a 100-meter dash, but we must resist that temptation and go for the long run. A strategy which might seem less spectacular, but which we believe is more efficient. So it's also managing expectations. At the same time, you're telling your story and listening to what people have to say.
I think people don't understand the challenges, obstacles, difficulties sometimes in achieving certain sustainability goals and the impacts they have, and whether it's readjusting a process internally for the manufacturing of something, or and just the process of getting approval internally by everybody that's involved, right? It's always the money people, the legal people, the corporate responsibility folks getting all on the same page in an agreement. I mean, that's time consuming, let alone the long-term impact of those changes that a company may make.
Absolutely. And having that as a dialogue and helping people to understand. When we were at Sodexo, we talked about cage-free eggs. And our commitment was to do cage-free shelled eggs. And we got pushback. Why don't you do cage-free all your eggs? And my response to that was, well, you have to look at everything that eggs are in. So you're now saying you want cage-free eggs in all the bread we sell, and cage-free eggs in all the cakes. And if we have the shelled egg, we can ensure where it came from. But if it's a product within a product, it's more difficult for us to unwind that supply chain and work with that supplier to make that ultimately desirable goal achievable if it truly is. And it's that I remember having that conversation with reporters and having them say, thank you for explaining it to me. I can explain that. That makes sense. It wasn't a dodge. It was very clear that the stuff we buy directly, we can impact very quickly compared to the stuff that is our supplier.
Right. Just like you said, the scalability for cage-free, that means more acreage. That means, so it takes time for those things to be able to be put in place, even if the goodwill is there to do it. It's allowing the time to catch up to the scalability of certain changes in the supply chain, for sure.
And then getting at something that's really important, which is assurance. How do people have confidence that you say you've done it, but have you really done it? So we hold companies accountable for, their financial reports are audited. And I've argued for more than a decade that sustainability metrics should be audited too, because otherwise, how are these metrics consistent, comparable, and decision useful for people? If you're going to decide whether or not to buy a product, how do you know it is what they say it is? How do you have the confidence that it truly is fair trade? There has to be a mechanism behind it. So that's also what has to be built in order to start telling this story and making these claims. Because you can talk about aspirations, but only so long. At some point, you have to endeavor to be that which you desire to appear, going back to Socrates.
Yeah, John, and I think the other issue too is we go back to listening to consumers, but it's also how many folks are you listening to? How much do they really represent of the consumer base, right? So, you think about again the cage-free eggs, situation. I know on the college campuses there might have been a very vocal small group of students that were passionate about that from an animal welfare standpoint, but to introduce that type of product into the meal plan program would have raised costs. So there could be a majority of the students that are like, I don't want to have to pay more. I don't really care about this issue. I just want to get my food and go. And so it's like, as an organization, in this case, an academic setting, do they listen to that smaller group that's demanding this, change based on animal welfare issues versus students who are paying a lot already for tuition, room and board, and are not wanting an all cost increase because they don't have the same, view of that animal welfare value.
Well,
and so I guess how do you, have you had a situation where you have to advise clients in terms of the cost benefit analysis of implementing a program because you're really addressing a small niche group of consumers,
Well, the way to do that is to have the conversations. And if you are addressing a small niche group of consumers, you can make that an option. You don't take away the other options necessarily, but you add that as an option. And if they are truly willing and able to pay for it, they do. And then if it becomes more and more popular, then you do more and more. We did the same thing with a program called Meatless Monday. We didn't take meat off the menu on Mondays. And we did this in the healthcare segment when I worked for the healthcare segment. We just made it an added option. And then we looked at it over time, which recipes are the most popular. Where are the sales? If the financial benefit is there and there's enough consumers that want something, and that's the whole alignment of environmental, social, and economic, where it appeals to all three. That's the difference between doing something for sustainability, which includes the sustainability of the business, and doing something simply for an environmental or social or idealistic reasons. That's not to say you don't do some things for idealistic reasons and build that into your costs, like safety. You're not going to sit there and say, well, we could save you money, client, but we're going to skip our safety training for our employees and your students, and we'll see how that goes. So there's some things that are negotiable and can be incrementally implemented, and some things that aren't. One of the things we found is that when we put healthy drinks in a place, in locations, people would gravitate toward them, but they resented it if we took out the unhealthy drinks. So it simply became the manner of having the same, let's say, soda or soft drink machine with both choices in it and refilling the ones that were more popular. And those were more profitable. And then gradually the number of those offerings expanded as the other ones shrank. But we were empowering people to make the choice that they wanted to, not dictating it. I think that's another very important thing with sustainability and anything else that has a values component.
Right. And I think what you're getting to is it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We don't have to remove everything and replace it. We can offer options and essentially meet the needs of people where they're at, from their
Exactly.
moral implications, from their political, ideological, whatever. There's an option there.
Right. If it's a small niche group they'll pay a premium price for a premium product, that does actually increase the bottom line if you price it properly.
Right. It's true. That's true. So there becomes a business case for that. And I think this kind of leads into our next area I'd like to get into, John, which is ideology and the politics of climate issues and sustainability issues. And we're in a moment where federal priorities are shifting or may shift away from ESG and climate action. We saw this a little bit in terms of DEI initiatives and reviewing those within the federal government and organizations and businesses reevaluating their commitments to certain DEI programs in reaction to that or in alignment with that. So, do you think companies will stay the course when it comes to sustainability?
The bottom line is, I know that companies are staying the course. And everything I'm going to say, obviously you expect it from a sustainability professional, but I'm going to do some citations, and I'm going to send you the links, Enrico, and you could include them so people want to look it up and make sure that I said it faithfully. Okay, so here goes. Harvard Business Review, on a study between April and May of this year, found that 13% of companies have retreated from their sustainability ambitions, while 53% have held steady and 32% have actually accelerated their efforts despite the headwinds. States that generate 1/3 of the U.S. economic output, GDP, are implementing state-level laws requiring greenhouse gas emissions reporting. That's California, New York, Illinois, New Jersey, and Colorado. That represents 6.6 trillion in GDP. And they also have established timelines for that implementation. And that has nothing to do with the federal government. I mean, they're state laws. Here's the thing. If you're a business in the United States and you want to work in those markets, you want to sell in those markets, you're going to have to do it. So the regulation at the state level is still continuing. And it's also continuing overseas in Europe and Asia and other places. And there's got to be a reason why. And there is. There's a macroeconomic trend toward business being accountable for things beyond shareholder bottom line, which was Milton Friedman's famous 1970s maxim. Since then, over the last 50 years, and ultimately those trends are more powerful than political changes and political winds and priorities. We saw this with socially responsible investing that has consistently gone up. When I first started, it was 1 in every $12 under professional asset management in the US. It's now 1 in every 3. And that has occurred despite changes in the politicians in Washington. What does influence it, and this is going to be no surprise to any economist, are economic shocks. The dot-com bust, the housing bubble, COVID, each of those things, people put their money, professional asset managers shifted money into companies that were managing risks and seizing opportunities through a larger dimension, through looking at environmental and social things, because those companies were producing a consistently stronger return, about 2.2% higher than the S&P 500. I'm also going to, you mentioned DEI. So let's look at DEI honestly. Shareholder resolutions against DEI continue to fail spectacularly. Typical results are 90% or higher of members voting against those proposals, because there's a risk of not recognizing that even though the federal government does have impact, they're not necessarily your primary stakeholder unless they own and run your business. And I'll give you the link for that statistic. The bottom line is boards and management recognize that if you position this thing as, we're going to reduce costs by shifting to more affordable power purchase agreements and sourcing our things locally, which was shortening your supply chains and making it more consistent. A lot of companies did that after COVID to make sure that things weren't traveling from places that they couldn't, get things from anymore. If you present that as a way of reducing risk and managing opportunities, your shareholders want that. Your customers want that. They want you to still be there. Your employees want you to stay in business. That's how, and that's where the communication has to be, away from moralizing, talking down to people. I have yet to meet a company that didn't say employees are our greatest asset, and we need to attract, hire, retain, and engage the best employees in order to meet our customers' desires and to meet investor expectations. That's the way we should be talking about DEI, because DEI is simply a strategy to achieve the business objective. Now, some companies have done it wrong and they've put in quotas and things like that, And they should be rethinking it. So when companies say we're rethinking and reviewing our DEI objectives, my response is terrific. Because if they're not adding value to your business, you should be rethinking them. The same goes with anything else a business is doing, whether it's rolling out a new product, a new logo, or trying to enter a new market or provide a new product or service. Put it to the test. If it can't pass the test, business shouldn't be doing.
So it's always the business case, right? It's integrating it.
I was going to say, we're seeing that companies that are talking about it, a lot of companies are green hushing or rights hushing for DEI. But those that are doing it are really, really focusing it on the business case, like the examples I gave earlier, which wrote their things before these headwinds. But, we had headwinds when we were first starting out in 2000, when no one had ever heard of what we were doing and didn't understand what we were doing. It's the same headwinds. And I have found over the course of my career that making the business case is the primary case. So, I talked about the different kinds of objectives, sales objectives. You want to maintain customers and increase sales of premium products. Financial objectives. You'd like to reduce costs, whether they're costs associated with permitting for environmental reasons or costs associated with paying health insurance because of to justify a safety program. And every one of these programs that I've been involved with over the course of my career has started out with the business case and succeeded because of the business case or refined itself in order to succeed because of the business case.
Yeah, I wanted to get into this this role communicators often have within an organization of being the reconnaissance, the scouts, getting the temperature right out there for a company. So what signals should communicators watch for in terms of policy or what's in the media or consumer behavior that might affect the sustainability strategy for their organization?
I think you touched on it, and you mentioned consumer behavior, and I think that's got to be one, but also investor behavior. And like I said, with socially responsible investing, it's growing every year. And would you be surprised to know that 98.6% of the Standard & Poor's 500 does sustainability reporting, including emissions? And that's in the last year we had data available, 2023. We'll see what the 2024 reports look like. And that does not include just the top, that's the S&P 500. It's 93% of the Russell 1000 companies. The biggest growth has been in the smaller half of the Russell 1000, issuing these reports in order to get investor favor. And they're getting investor favor. And that means they're listening to their stakeholders. Yes, you have to listen to the voices in the world, but also look at what else is going on in the world. And I think communications, to your point, the canary in the coal mine or the reconnaissance, you have to do your reconnaissance. You have to recognize that there are a lot of stakeholders in your business that are people who truly have a stake in your success. They want you to succeed. They're invested, in some cases, literally in your success. Those are the voices that are more important. There are those voices that may be loud, but do they really have an impact on your business? And I find it interesting that one of the companies where the DEI proposal failed was John Deere, which we saw big headlines for because of activists going after them and them saying we're going to go back, review our DEI and tone down our DEI. But then their shareholders came right back and said, no, it's a business enhancing strategy. We want you to keep doing it. Now, which one would you listen to? An activist who's never put a dollar on the bottom line, or the customers and your shareholders?
No, and I think, John, the point that, it is referring to the data, right? It's I think you can't make decisions anecdotally. I think you have to reference these indexes that you mentioned and how they appear in terms of really informing. And I think as a communicator, you need to be that advisor in these cases, to be able, but advise based on fact, on data, on examples that you can bring up, not just anecdotal conversations that may be picked up in the media, but don't really reflect the best scenario for a business strategy or a sustainability strategy for a business.
And that's why, yes, the SEC has put their climate disclosure rules on indefinite hold, but the European Union is moving forward, for example. So companies that are producing that data with a single yardstick and a single way of reporting it provides consistent, comparable, and decision useful data. Because I got so tired, even in public relations, of companies saying we're the number one at, companies led by left-handed executives who were born on a Tuesday because they want to be the number one at something. You can't choose your own adventure. If people are making fact-based decisions, and I know we live in a somewhat fact-challenged world, but people are making fact-based decisions, especially investors, but consumers do when they are presented with the facts. And if the other voices can't marshal data to support what they are saying, it's going to be very hard to make a compelling case for that in the boardroom. That's why you get 97% of people voting say, no, we recognize the value it brings to attract, hire, retain, and engage the best employees through the program that we have implemented that has reduced turnover, reduced recruitment costs, helped our company run more efficiently because we don't have to replace people, and then train them up on the knowledge base they need to do the business. So making that business case and being able to support it is critical. And I've long been an advocate, and in Europe, they do this. They assure that data, which makes it much easier. And that's where the US was sort of moving tentatively with much less robust data reporting even than the Europeans have been using for years. But still, that's where we need to get and where we need to go. But things like CDP, which was formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, they have a consistent metric that they use and a consistent yardstick. TCFD, the Task Force for Financial-Related Climate Disclosures, they have a consistent framework. People can look to those reports and compare apples to apples. And this is where they get into the danger of companies not talking enough about this. What happens if your investors want to know this and you're not talking about it? What happens if your consumers want to know it and you're not talking about it? So there is a risk, and I use that word deliberately, in getting too quiet and not just saying, we're not going to say anything and hope that the current political winds don't notice us.
Well, that brings up a question, and I know you provided data at the beginning of this, which was that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but around 80% or just around 80% of companies have either maintained or even increased their sustainability efforts. But is there a risk for brands that continue to lead on sustainability in this environment? Since this issue has been polarized so much by the administration.
Well, sure. And these are, in some cases, often polarizing issues. But I know a lot of companies will sit there and say, we don't want to stick our neck out. We don't want to take the risks of that, let's say a Unilever does or did and still does. But I point out to them that there are things that they've already decided in their business case that differentiate them. We're going to be a great employer. We're going to have the lowest cost premium products or whatever it is. And to pick those things that they're already saying differentiate them and talk about those, because some of those have, I believe sustainability can, not everything, but sustainability mindset can impact many of these things. And that's a way to talk about them in a safer way, but to be not afraid to put their toes over the line a little bit to differentiate yourselves. Because let's face it, if compliance is all you're doing, you will never, you may stay out of the courtroom, but you won't win the hearts and minds of the people you need to be successful, unless every single one of your competitors falls short or is criminal. So that's no way to attract customers, employees, investors, or anyone to care about your business if you simply want to be in the middle of the pack and avoid falling behind the bare minimum expectations. That said, I'm going to surprise you. Not everything that this administration has done has been negative to this mindset. For example, Trump administration, he recently signed an executive order releasing companies from giving quarterly reports. That's an interesting concept because Paul Pullman did that in Unilever in 2009, explaining that the temptation to work toward the next set of numbers often led people to make poor decisions for the long term of the company, such as delaying an investment or not buying a piece of equipment that would improve production efficiency because you want to make the next quarterly number, so you delay the purchase and therefore don't realize the savings for a longer period of time, which would help justify the upfront cost to begin with. So not everything they're saying and doing is wrong. Shining a bright light on things to make sure that they're being done well is actually a good thing. And at the same time, companies need to remember that the political winds shift often and they don't blow consistently.
Going back to us communicators and the role in that, and particularly in this environment, helping executives stay grounded in the long-term purpose, even when the short-term pressures mount. Like you said, it's temporary. These are transitional, winds up.
The
How
winds
can we
always
best do
are.
that?
Yeah. The best way comes back to most companies have a 5 or 10-year plan, and it's a plan around growth, profitability, and how do these things affect the attractiveness of your company to grow? Do you become an exemplar? If you're the safest company in a certain sector, people who are in a community that want you to hire from within that community might like the safest company to be hiring their loved ones. They also might like the premium products to be closer to them, or things that they feel reflect their values or that do reflect their values. And if you can tie it back to your financial goals, your sales goals. We want to increase our sale market by increasing the size of our company or going into this market, but that market is a strong market for this. And we need to provide them with that in order to meet that market expectation. We talked about college students with Sodexo. That was the leading edge for a lot of the sustainability programs that we did at Sodexo, because college students are idealistic and they are passionate about these issues. And that was often the place where we would roll out a program to see how invaluable it was to the customers, because our clients were the colleges and the customers were the students. And if they bought fair trade coffee or fair trade chocolate, exam week was always a good week for fair trade chocolate, and coffee, because students were staying up because they were studying, and you could track the sales, just as we do for when in the semester do students drink more coffee. Not surprising, it's when they have to cram for tests, and make
Right.
sure we have it. It's the same thing. It's the market research, but talk to it that way as this supports the company's articulated strategy. Don't say it as something new. We're making every day a better day. This is our plan for a better tomorrow. We're Lafarge, we're the world's second largest building materials company. We want to become the largest building materials company. This is the Lafarge way we're going to do that. It's tied right to the business.
Looking at the future of sustainability, particularly sustainability strategy, in your role, what trends are you watching in sustainability, from like circular economy to climate disclosure? I know you touched on it a little bit, but what are you seeing?
What I'm seeing is really the shift back to that old familiar, and I feel like a broken record, the business case. Why are we doing these things? How do they help our company be more successful? How do we leverage what our company can do and does do, and our expertise and our actions and our influence to achieve our business goals that are also achieving these other more esoteric goals? And I think that's really the answer, because when we were at Lafarge, the number one issue was HIV/AIDS. And we realized that as a construction materials and building company, we couldn't really impact that issue. But the number two issue was homelessness. And so I strategized and built a partnership with the world's leading home building charity, Habitat for Humanity. And we became their biggest partner initially in North America and then around the world for the products that we provided. There was a clear linkage between what we were doing, if you will, socially in the community to help with our products. And not surprisingly, when we showcased our products at those Habitat builds, we invited our customers and prospects to come build with us. They got to see our products in action and what they could do, but they also were contributing to their local community. That's a perfect example of an alignment between the business and growing the business case. And in some cases, we got permits faster so that we could support a Habitat build. But the interesting thing is, one of the biggest benefits of that program was using it in our communications. We used images of Habitat builds in our recruitment, and it became the number one reason that people came to work for our company over our competitors at a time where we were struggling to hire people, and particularly engineers, because of the .coms that were booming at the time and were offering bigger salaries. We talked about being the kind of company that built the world you wanted to live in, which went back to the tagline of materials for building our world. And that we asked people, why did they come to the company? So suddenly we were having an influence on the HR objective. We were having an influence on the public relations and communications outreach. We were helping the government relations get the permits faster. So we were having an impact on others' success within the organization. Building those types of coalitions is critical. Going forward, always has been, but going forward, make friends with your risk manager and your safety people. They know how much it's costing you a year, and you can absolutely cost justify a safety program that will reduce not only lost time, but will reduce your health insurance premiums. It will reduce your medical costs. It can reduce lawsuits, and it will help recruit because people want to work for a company that's committed to the safety of its employees and its customers.
Well, it's hard to have conversations these days without looking at the AI of things and how they impact just about every part of our life. But I think there's an intersection here with artificial intelligence influencing maybe sustainability in terms of its ability in helping support reporting or stakeholder engagement, or even helping with strategy development. What are you seeing, and do you believe there's a place for AI sustainability strategy?
Everybody wants AI to be the silver bullet to a lot of problems, but I've got good news. In some cases, it truly can be, and in some cases, is being in sustainability in particular. One of the most onerous, time and therefore cost-consuming tasks is for sustainability reporting is finding, checking, aggregating, collecting, analyzing, and calculating things, from your safety numbers to your greenhouse gas emissions, which are based on your fuel consumption and your energy, electricity use. AI can and is being used to kind of crawl through that data that's already in your company. And if you can teach the AI where it's housed, it can go get that and bring it back to you and help speed up that task, which often takes months, and bring it to the factor. I've seen it go down to as little as 2 weeks. At the same time, it can flag where there's missing data, which is harder if you reach out to an operation and say, I need your electricity bills. They add up 11 out of 12 by mistake and send you the numbers. An AI, which is going to the original bills, can make sure it doesn't miss one. And if there is one missing or misfiled, it can say incomplete data here. So that is a huge, huge time and cost savings. Multiplying by the corresponding emission factors and developing greenhouse gas equivalents. AI does that, and I've seen it doing it. Data analysts will still have a role, but their role will be more in setting up the AI and dispatching it, error checking it when it comes back in. And then you can go even further, working with a company called CarboLedger. It has an AI called Report Writer, and it takes the existing reports that your company is producing, your 10Ks, your annual report, and so forth, and it's finding where you mentioned those things. And increasingly, we're seeing those things mentioned in financial disclosures and in more traditional disclosures, and bringing them together and literally filling out a first draft of the CDP or GRI or some of these other questionnaires, enabling then the sustainability people to go back in and look at it. It's not just copy pasting from those, it's actually able to write them using your voice, the voice of the company, when you teach it to do it, which is, again, a huge time and cost savings. And it also helps ensure consistency between your reporting, because these things often have different reporting cycles. The sustainability reports traditionally come out in September, and that's when people do these other sustainability disclosures. But if you had last year's annual report and last year's 10K and they contain that data, which I'm a big advocate for, single integrated reporting, it's much easier to get it, and an AI can do that very quickly.
Amazing. I think that it will be such a help for a lot of these organizations. I think it's particularly avoiding redundancy. I think there's sometimes as people move on from different companies, there's a little bit of history that's lost, and people remembering programs that were tried or maybe that were attempted, and so you sort of reinvent the wheel. So if you had an AI tool that could help you go through all of your documentation and you find out, yeah, we did try this type of program before, and it was mildly successful, or it failed because of this, and it can give you either, advice to stay away. We tried it, it doesn't work, or we tried it, it didn't work because of this, but maybe we can approach it now with these new things. So I think that could be very helpful for organizations for sure.
And there's another way, right? I talked about just crawling through the data to try to build the report, but AI can actually monitor it and collect the data in real time. So if you and I own a car and we suddenly notice that our car is getting poorer mileage, we might be tempted to take it to the mechanic and say, something's wrong here. Can you check it out before it breaks down and leaves you stranded? Well, if a company has a fleet of vehicles, they're not going to be able to do that. They won't have line of sight to that, or equipment. But let's continue with the vehicles analogy. So if AI is checking your fuel consumption, which is billed every month, and it's billed by vehicle, it can literally flag if a like piece of equipment is not performing, so that you, as the sustainability person within the organization, can provide that feedback to that local manager who is responsible for their profit and loss and say, car number 35 seems to be having some problems. It's not getting the same mileage as the like vehicles that are going the same distance the same days, because AI can grab all that data. And that's a value that sustainability can bring in real time to the business to help identify potential risks or breakdowns before they occur. And if you were to first build the program and then use that to get other people who have objectives to see the value of what you're asking them for, or in this case, asking them for access for, it helps. And this is what I have done. When you do it manually, it's much slower and you can't do it in real time. Just imagine the cost savings if you could have avoided that last time your major piece of equipment broke down and stopped you from producing product for whatever number of days.
Yeah, that could have real impact, particularly if you have a lot of machinery, a lot of equipment, age cycles in terms of replacement. It could kind of alert you to all of that. John, one sort of interesting aspect of the AI and sustainability is the fact that, AI is an enormous consumption of energy. Also, when you think about the impact it has on land, the requirement for these data centers to do. So it's like you're using a tool to help you sustainable, but is it the most sustainable tool right now because of the energy consumption that's needed for that artificial intelligence? And so I feel like there's a little conundrum that may come from using AI to help with sustainability.
There is a conundrum.
Nicely.
Well, it doesn't align nicely, but that's the other thing about data, right? There's a lot of data we don't have. I talked about the time and therefore the cost associated with all those data analysts or people trying to find that data, in the various operations. Think about Sodexo, global company, and in dozens of countries, everybody out there doing it. They're burning the midnight oil. Their lights are on. Their computers are running. That's also energy that is being used that is no way, it's calculated in the overall emissions of the company, but it's not calculated as related to the AI doing the same task. So we don't have a way yet of doing an apples to apples comparison, but certainly it bodes well to be looked at and to look at it and not just say, oh, we saved this much time and therefore we saved this much electricity, unless you're willing to say, okay, how much electricity and where was it generated? And, if it was done in India and it was coal fired versus if you've done it in your own office and you have a hydroelectric plant that's providing your electricity, the carbon footprint's actually gone up. So be careful about getting your claims ahead of your skis.
No, exactly. And I think just, again, being authentic, being transparent, and having those conversations, they may be, hard, like, okay, what's the cost-benefit analysis in using AI in terms of, also trying to be sustainable in energy use. But I appreciate you tackling that with me. All right, John, well, we're coming to the end of today's episode. Again, I can't thank you enough for coming on COMMSversations podcast to share your thoughts and expertise on the state of sustainability, the future of sustainability. So I like to wrap up by just having, what are the 2-3 takeaways you would like our audience to have from our conversation today?
Well, as sustainability communicators, the important thing to recognize is sustainability is not dead and sustainability is not going anywhere. How you communicate it is going to be so critical in terms of whether it's successful as a business driving strategy and therefore receives greater support, or is seen as something that's ancillary or nice to have and optional and potentially more of a risk. And so I think communicators need to really understand the business goals and objectives and how what they're doing in sustainability, that the sustainability people are doing, can help that. At the same time, they can go back to the sustainability people and tell them, this is what we're hearing in the market from our customers. This is what we're hearing from our investors. We need to refine our approach.
Well, thank you so much, John, again, for joining us today. I'll make sure I include links to the references that John made throughout the podcast, and also links to his information and also to his book. So if you're interested in getting more information about this topic, it's a great resource. Also, for those that are interested in learning more about the COMMSversations podcast, make sure you go to COMMSversations.com. That's COMMS versations.com, where you can link to all of your favorite platforms for listening or watching your podcast. Until next time, thank you very much for joining the COMMSversations.